Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome again to the second session with Crystal. And without further ado, Crystal, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm happy to see you all again today. So last time, as a reminder, right, we talked about what the importance of training was, right, to encouraging open science or open scholarship practices, and some of the basics around like figuring out like if I'm going to make a training, how can I make it most effective for my audience? So one of the things that I had you do over the last week was to come up with 3 to 5 learning objectives for training that you might give. It's a hypothetical, or it could actually be a training that you're already planning to give. Um, and we're actually going to work through some of that today because we are going to talk about um, make sure they have the right thing shared. We're going to chat about how we can adapt our training materials or create, as the case may be, depending on what it is that you're doing. So we're going to talk a bit about, okay, we have this idea, right, of the training that we're going to do. We have this idea of what we want to see happen. And so then how can we actually develop a training, create materials, or plan for creating materials or adapting materials so that we can have an effective training session? And so you might remember last time, right, we talked about Bloom's taxonomy. We talked about how it's a good idea to have um, learning objectives that are grounded in something that you can actually observe happening, right? So it can be really vague if you say, I want people to be able to understand something, because how do you know whether they actually understand something? So if you say, I want somebody to understand open science, what does it mean for them to be able to understand open science? So you might, instead of saying as a learning objective, I want them to be able to understand open science, maybe say, I want them to be able to define open science, because you can actually look at a definition that somebody has produced and say, this is a good definition, or this definition needs a little bit more work. And so just reminding folks of this, kind of at that lower end of this triangle or this pyramid, right? We have that basic grounding, right? Everybody is going to, at some point, need to be able to understand things, to be able to remember things. Um, and sometimes that's also aligns with, the relative importance of the goals. So in one sense, sometimes it's stuff that maybe you might have something to remember, for instance, if maybe you don't need people to memorize all aspects of a particular policy. Say a data sharing policy, for instance. You don't need them to know exactly what the wording is and stuff, but you need them to be able to find it, right? You need them to be able to know that there's a policy there and where to go to look it up. And maybe also to recognize that policy when they see it, right? So remembering is kind of that base level of here, I need to be able to recognize it when I see it. And then kind of moving up further, that implies a greater understanding, a deeper understanding of the concept. So you want people to start with being able to remember things and to be able to understand things. And as they get more familiar with the concepts and how they relate to one another, then you can start asking them, okay, I want you to be able to apply your knowledge into a specific setting, or I want you to be able to analyze information that's given to you and kind of see, what's the best course of action, or to be able to compare and contrast, to be able to relate different concepts to one another. And then as they get more comfortable with that, right, then you get into the really deeper work, the work that I think we all hope that people get to eventually, where they're actually saying, okay, this is the course of action that I need to take because X, Y, Z, right? These are the things that I'm going to do in my own research, and here's why I'm going to do those. Because we don't want people to just do things because we tell them to do them. We want them to understand why they're doing it and to be able to make decisions on their own about what course of action is best to make. And then, of course, at that top, we want people to be able to create new things, right? We want them to be able to engage in research while engaging in open scholarship practices, and to be able to develop and to to spread knowledge throughout that way. So I'm curious for those. So I think most people did end up coming up with, we said that we'd come up with 3 to 5, learning objectives, a draft of that. I wanted to kind of pause early on in the beginning and just ask folks how did you feel about doing that? Like, what was that hard for you, or did you find that to be really easy? What were some of the things that went through your head as you were drafting those learning objectives for today? And you can just come off mute and say something, or if the chat's easier, you're also welcome to use the chat.
Thank you so much. Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Advocacy, at which level taxonomy are here advocating for open science belongs to?
Oh, that's a great question. Advocacy, I would say, I think for me, I think you can do bits of I think advocacy is not so. I think advocacy relates to learning and that you need to do learning in order to advocate. But I think that you can kind of integrate advocacy into all stages of the learning process. Um, but I think advocacy is probably most effective once they're at least in that kind of intermediate area, right? If you imagine, if somebody asks you about a particular governmental policy, right? If you don't know a whole lot about that governmental policy, what it says, what it means, what the implications are for it, any context that could have led to the development of the policy, it's, I think, a little bit harder to advocate, right? You can do it, but I think if you start to get questions, if you start to get into the particulars, I think that can be very difficult for folks. So if you're hoping for your trainees to be able to advocate for the implementation of particular policies or particular practices, I think they can start to do some of that earlier on in the process. But if they're really hoping to dig into it, to try to build policy at their institution or something, you want them to kind of probably be closer to that analyze, evaluate, create sort of level, because you want them to understand what it is that they're looking at, how those things relate to one another, and importantly, the context in which folks are operating. Because as we know, right, policies are very contextual, particularly when we think about how effective they're going to be. But it's an interesting question because I think learning can lead to advocacy, but I don't know that advocacy itself is something that I would consider a learning goal, because the other thing is you cannot control whether someone decides that they're going to advocate for something, right? We don't want to force people to advocate for things. So for me personally, I think I would put that, we talked last time about secondary goals. So as I'm kind of working through the question here, I would have that as a secondary goal, perhaps, that this is something that I hope people feel maybe confident that they can advocate. But I wouldn't try to mandate that they advocate, because they may end up learning things and then saying, actually, I don't think that this is for me. And I think we have to leave space for that. In as much as I would love for everyone to be on board with open scholarship, sometimes some folks may decide that some practices aren't for them. But that is a great question. So thank you for asking that. Was it hard for folks to come up with 3 to 5, or did you find that? Oh, sorry, somebody said something, I think.
It was just Aman saying thank you.
Yes, thank you, Aman, for the question. So it wasn't that difficult. So some folks felt that it was pretty easy. If there were folks that thought it was hard, it would be interesting to hear maybe what about it was hard. For me, even though I've been doing this for a long time, sometimes it's hard for me to figure out what it is that I actually want to observe them doing. And so it can be interesting sometimes to kind of navigate that because we want it to be something, right, that we can actually observe. And so I might actually, as folks maybe think about that, let us actually go back to, I'll post this link here. We've have it a couple of times in the chat already, but I'm thinking maybe it might be fun to split into groups because we do have a larger group here. Maybe we could do some breakouts for a few minutes. So, you know, folks actually had written out their objectives, right? So you have that. If you don't have it, I think it's okay to perhaps listen. But what we can do today is we can break out into groups, and for about, I don't know, 15 minutes or so, maybe as groups, you can talk about your learning objectives. So share, you know, what your topic is, who you think your audience might be, what your learning objectives are, and then perhaps as a group discuss, you know, your learning objectives and think about, are these things that I'm expecting the trainee to be able to do at the end of the training? How well does this align with that Bloom's taxonomy verbs? So that's the that is this list that we went through last time. So does this actually align with something that is an actual thing that you would have somebody do, an actual act? And then is this reasonable for my audience to be able to do at the end of it? So I think we talked about this a little bit last time. If you only have 30 minutes with somebody, your goals for that are going to be much different than if you're doing like a week-long training seminar, right? You're going to have probably deeper learning objectives that are higher up on that pyramid, right? Higher up here. If you're doing a week-long training versus if you just have 30 minutes with somebody, you might want to be lower. And then again, yeah, is this something that I can observe and measure? So maybe we can break out into groups of 2 to 3 for 15 minutes or so. Let folks walk through their learning objectives to talk them over, write down questions that you have. And if you have time, maybe you can revise them. You might find that some objectives you're happy with them as they are, but perhaps in talking with your partners, you're like, actually, maybe I would word this slightly differently. And so in this next column, maybe you revise that a little bit. Do folks have questions about what they'll be doing? All right. So I think I can maybe, let's see.
I'll do it.
Okay, perfect.
I'll create 6 breakout rooms because we have about 18 people
Yeah,
here.
so it's
Yeah.
probably going to be better if 2 to 3 people are in each room. So that makes
Okay. Okay. So I'll
6 would
do
be great.
6. Yeah.
And then I'll give you guys a few minutes to go through stuff, and then I'll start going into each of the rooms just to answer any questions that pop up. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about what that looks like.
Perfect. So now you should have a window that prompts you to go to your assigned breakout room. But if you have any problem, let me know. Nice. People are moving smoothly. Dr. Howard, are you finding it difficult to join? You are in breakout room 2.
Okay. All right, I think everyone is back. So I'm curious, in the chat, can you give me either a 1, 2, or 3? 1, you found that to be incredibly easy, old hat, very, very nice, very easy. 2 was, this is a little bit challenging for me. Maybe I haven't done it before. Or, you know, there were parts of it that were a little bit confusing. And then 3 was like, I felt completely lost. Or I felt like this was really challenging for me. This is really new for me. If folks can put a 1, 2, or 3 into chat, I'm curious to see like what how folks were feeling. And the 2 and 3 is also, you know, it's fairly normal. It's still a 2 for me, even though I've done this a while. Okay, so we're seeing a smattering there of some good responses, some ranges, right? So that's good. So I think one thing that's really important, so some folks may have already worked perhaps even with Bloom's taxonomy specifically before. It's a pretty popular for folks that have gotten training in making learning objectives. Bloom's taxonomy is a popular resource. It's not the only thing that's out there, but it's pretty common because it's very practical in nature. But I still find it challenging. Actually, while you guys were in your breakout room, Salamis and I were talking about how this is probably like the key part of creating a training, because you are deciding here and now what the foundation is for the training that you're going to be giving. And so it's really important to understand what your audience is, where they're coming from, how much time you're going to have with them, what you can really hope to accomplish during that time. And that sets the foundation for everything else that you do with regard to developing your training. And so going back to this, you know, really setting the stage for having a good training, it requires you to really understand your audience. And in all cases, you may not know exactly what you can expect from your audience. Maybe they will have more experience or less experience than you thought. That happens, especially if you don't have you know, you're not teaching your undergrad students. You're maybe just doing a training for some people who've asked you to come to their lab or something like that. You can't always know exactly, but having at least some idea of what your audience is going to want out of the training, of what you hope to impart with them on the training, and also, you know, how much time you have with them can really impact what these goals are. And that can then serve as a foundation for you to actually develop that training out or to adapt it if a training already exists, but you're just trying to make some changes to it. And one of my favorite activities that I love to do that really helps to set me in understanding how my learning objectives are actually going to map on to what people are going to be doing as a part of the training is I map my learning objectives onto instructional activities. So I have an example here. And I'll go through what this means. But these column, you know, pre-readings, slides, follow-up resources, assignments, those can really be anything. You can have discussion prompts, you can have exam questions, you can have videos. Like those are not the only 4 things that you can have in a training. Those are just some common ones that I know of from trainings. But what I like to do is I like to create a table that looks like this, and I have a template that I've shared with folks. Some of you may have already opened it up and started playing around with it, which is totally fine. I write my learning objectives down here on this left side. I have 1 line per learning objective. And then I think about like, what am I going to do throughout the time that I have with the participants? And how is that going to map on? So like as a specific example, maybe for a training on introduction to open scholarship, I might have 4 learning objectives. Maybe I want them to describe open scholarship and its practices. Maybe I want them to be able to describe the benefits and mandates in performing open scholarship. I want them to describe barriers, risks, and costs associated with open scholarship practices. As I mentioned last time, I'm really not a huge fan of evangelizing. I really don't like to give people only one side of things. I like for them to be able to make informed decisions about what practices are important to them. So I almost always have something around what's the hard part of all of this? And then summarizing perhaps research evidence supporting open scholarship adoption, right? And so if I choose to have a pre-reading, maybe I have a pre-reading that's an article that I like, that's called What is Open Science, right? Maybe I give that out to the trainees ahead of time and I say, hey, if you have time before the training, please give this a read, right? So that is an instructional activity. It's actually technically happening before your training even starts. But it is something that hopefully helps them to be able to do what? Well, I hope that it helps them to be able to describe what open scholarship is, what its practices are, right? So you're really making sure as you're filling out this, that you have an activity for each one of those learning objectives. Because it's not fair to evaluate whether somebody is learning something if you don't teach it to them. It also helps to encourage me especially to have a variety of activities throughout, and to help engage learners in multiple ways. So if I only have a pre-reading for something, but I don't mention it in my slides, that seems like a missed opportunity for me, right? Or if I only have it in the slides, but I don't ever ask them to actually do anything else with it, that's also a missed opportunity. You want them to engage with stuff in multiple ways, but you'll notice there are some columns where I don't have stuff. That's okay. You don't have to have something for every cell in this table. In fact, it's probably overwhelming, but you want to have at least one thing, right? And so when I'm first developing this, I actually don't necessarily have slides made, right? But I might make some notes in here. Okay, I want to have a slide that has a definition on it. I want to have a slide that lists some practices, right? I might actually start to kind of think about what do I do? So if I'm going to talk about benefits and mandates, okay, what are some of the things that I want to talk about? So maybe I make some notes, right? And so I'm not actually listing specific numbers for slides, but I do have okay, I'll talk about this, I'll talk about this. So mandates, okay, in the US, I'm going to talk about the OSCP memo because that's the thing that everybody's talking about. It's a memo that the US government sent out a couple of years ago that said every you're going to have to share your data for all of your federally funded projects. And also your papers are going to have to be open access at the time of publication. And so that might be something, if I know I'm presenting to a US audience, I say, okay, I need to make sure that I have something in here on that, right? And so you have these slides, you have this column here where you kind of list out, okay, maybe what the content is, or if you already have slides that are made, you might actually list the exact slides. And then maybe I have follow-up resources that I send after the training and say, hey, if you want a deeper dive into this, right? And that's usually the difference here between pre-readings and follow-up resources. I very rarely send an academic article as a pre-reading. Even if my audience is very well educated, maybe they all have PhDs, I still very rarely send an academic article because those are usually not, I mean, we've all read academic articles. They're not necessarily the most, they're not necessarily easy to get into. I mean, unless an article is just very, very well written. But most academic articles are actually not really great primers. So I tend to not, they also tend to be long. So if I send a pre-reading out, it's usually maybe 1 or 2 pages, maybe 3 at most. But I try to keep pre-readings pretty short. The follow-up resources are where I am more willing to be like, hey, there's this academic article that you might be interested in, or there's this specific thing that you might be interested in. And when I see a question here, the difference between open scholarship and open science, that is a great question. So I can chat about that real quick. So there's 3 terms that are kind of used interchangeably in this space. The first is open scholarship, the second is open research, and the third is open science. Some of that's just regional differences. People talk about, in the UK, they really like to talk about open research. I tend to use open scholarship because it's the broadest term. So if I'm talking to a mixed audience, so I don't know where people's backgrounds are, or I know for a fact that there's going to be some folks in humanities, there's going to be some folks in STEM, I talk about it in terms of open scholarship, because that's broad. Not all scholarship, not all work that academics do is research. It may be scholarly work, but it's not research, and it may be research, but it's not science. So evaluation is something that, for folks that are in evaluation space, there's kind of a bit of a tension between whether evaluation and research are the same thing or different or related, or to what extent they're related. There's a lot of debate in that space. So I kind of adjust what I'm talking about depending on the audience. Open scholarship is the most common term, but I tend to see that as the most specific term. And then to me, open research is slightly broader than open science. Open science tends to focus a lot on experimentation. Open research might include, qualitative, although a lot of qualitative researchers would also say that they are also scientists. And then open scholarship is even broader than that. So that may not include, it would include activities that are not research, but are still scholarly. So yeah. So those kind of get thrown about a lot, but that's how I kind of make sense of those terms. But yeah, I think, in thinking about how you want people to engage with the material, it's really important to give people a variety of ways of doing so. And also just making sure that it maps on, because if you find that you have instructional activities that don't map on to a learning objective, that's a sign of one of two things. One, that may be the best instructional activity on the planet. Maybe you have a really great discussion question, but if it doesn't map onto a learning objective, then should you have it in this training? Maybe you still want to have it in this training, that's okay, but it may not be beneficial. It may not be as beneficial as it could be if it were in a different kind of training. Or it could be, I have a lot of activities on this, but I don't have a learning objective. I'm missing a learning objective. I'm actually training people on something, but I'm not telling them that I'm training them on that. So sometimes it means you need to add a learning objective, and sometimes it means you need to take out an instructional activity. So I find this is a good way for me to kind of just get an idea of what a balance might look like. And again, these are just 4 things that I picked, but you can videos, games, discussion prompts, exams. There are lots of different activities, right, that are instructional in nature. It doesn't have to be these 4. And so I'd like to encourage folks to try. We'll break out into, perhaps we can break out into the same groups that we were broken out into before. If you would like to open that, you'll get a document that looks like this. I also sent this on Slack. I also sent it as an email, so it doesn't super matter how you get it. But what you'll want to do if you're doing it via Google is to just make a copy of it. So file and make a copy. Or it may even prompt you to make a copy. And then just make a copy and put your session objectives. You can ignore this second one. We'll talk about that next week. Just this first tab with the blue. And just, write your session objectives in there, your learning objectives that you've been working on. And then you can change these. They don't have to stay the same. I have them in here just for illustration purposes. But maybe as your group, you guys can talk about, okay, if this is my learning objective, what are some activities that I can do? And maybe we can spend, another 15 minutes or so just kind of working through that. It's okay if you don't get through all of them. Maybe you guys can rotate, maybe each person does one and then just kind of see where you're at. But just brainstorm. And so you're welcome to write in here however you want. And you can change these headings. If you don't want to have slides in your training, that's totally fine. And just kind of start to brainstorm, okay, what would I do in the training? If these are my learning objectives, what am I actually having people do? How am I actually teaching them this material? Do folks have questions about that?
Sorry?
Do folks have questions about those instructions?
Yeah, slide means, is it the total slide for each learning objective?
So slide, can keep slides if you want. If you are going to have a presentation, you can have it. But slides, you can do it one of two ways. If you already have a PowerPoint, which I'd be a little bit surprised, but if you have something that's already prepared, you could list out specifically which ones. But you could also just take some notes, like, okay, like for the open scholarship one, like I might say, okay, I want to make sure that I have a definition on there. So you might just make a note in that cell, like include a slide with a definition on it, or something like that. So just notes about like what you might actually present in those slides. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So Tony?
Yeah, I'm trying to find out what we are going to be doing differently in our groups, which we different from what we just did by analyzing those our objectives. Because now we are still going to use those objectives and put them in those documents. I just wanted to be clear.
Yeah. So now we're taking it a step further. We're taking those objectives that you guys have been working on, and we're thinking about what the actual activities are that we would have our participants do. So, or how we're actually training them. So what information would we give them to help them to be able to meet that learning objective? What would we have them do so that they could practice meeting that learning objective? Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
So as a, just kind of as a, this may be helpful. So like going back here to this one, so you've got your learning objectives, right? You've got these, although these are going to be different than the ones that you have. Here's where the fun is going to be for the next 15 minutes or so. We're going to have you guys think about what are some things that somebody might do, what might they read, or what might I present to them, or what might they discuss, or what videos might they watch, whatever your activities are. And again, you don't have to keep these 4. It could be any 4, or it could be only 3. It's up to you. But think of it, discuss in your groups, like what are some things to help your audience get to the point where they can actually meet these learning objectives.
I think a fun thing that you could add is in-session activities. I think it could be nice to replace one of these with in-session activities, because you guys have been through a lot of in-session activities. So it might be easier for you to come up with these.
Yeah, absolutely. You could even take the assignment, we could change assignments to in session activities if that's helpful. Samira?
Well, can I just, I've seen that Lemmy said that we can like write about in-session activities, because I already started brainstorming for my topic that I want to present. So shall I write my activities that I want to present, or just talk about the in-session activities now?
I would say whatever is most helpful for you in your training goals. So if it's helpful to think about a broad range of things, I think that that's helpful. If you only want to think about one thing and you want to hone on that, then the in-session one or the slides or whichever one, you can pick one and hone in on it. But if you've already been brainstorming, I think this is a great opportunity to talk with the people in your group and see about where they see the alignment too. So
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I will open up the groups, the breakout rooms now. They'll be the same ones that you were in previously, so the discussion would be easier. Okay, so I think now you should, yeah, you should have the rooms. Some people, I think I will assign. Aman, which room were you in previously? Do you remember?
Group 2.
Okay.
Let me see. Yeah.
And Dr. Banjo, do you remember which group you were in? worries. I will try to.
Room 5 could probably, yep. There we go.
Yeah. Lara, if you're trying to speak. Lara, your voice is breaking up really bad.
Room 2. Can you hear me, Lamis?
Your voice was really breaking.
Yes,
You were in
2
room
last
2?
week.
No worries, Clara. You're in room 3 now. So I think now you should have a prompt.
Okay.
Okay.
I said I was in
That's really bad. I think she completely dropped. What I could understand is
All right, we'll give folks just another second to let Zoom usher them back in here, and then we'll close with some additional thoughts. I think folks are back. All right, so again, if we want to just in the chat real quick, one, if that was really easy, you felt like you had a lot of ideas for activities that people could do right off the bat for your particular learning objectives. 2 was maybe some of them were a little bit easier than others, but there's some that you're probably going to want to mull over a little bit if you do a training on this. And then 3 was I really struggled to think about what activities somebody might do to learn about these objectives, if you want to put that in the chat. So 1, super easy. 2, had a little bit of difficulty, and 3 was, this was actually really hard for me. So we're seeing some two is probably actually the most, I mean, for folks who've been doing teaching for a long time, it tends to be a lot easier to come up with different activities because you've tried different things in the past, right? You've gone through different activities. I think especially for folks who are a little bit newer to open scholarship, maybe you have some ideas on what could work, but maybe you're not fully convinced that that'll work or not work. I think a lot of times people really heavily rely on slides early on in their training trajectory, which is not necessarily a bad thing. The slides themselves can often be resources that people can use after the training. But if you can incorporate discussions or activities or anything that can actually help people get their hands on what it is that you're trying to teach them, that can give them a little bit more feeling of investment in the actual activity itself that you're trying to get them to do, and also better help them understand what's going on. So Of course, it was just a kind of off the cuff. You're just throwing out some ideas for what might work. Hopefully we're able to exchange some thoughts there. For next week, we're going to talk about actually measuring training effectiveness. So what does it mean to actually have an effective training? What does it mean to measure learning? How do we observe learning? And so we'll kind of take this and we'll continue to develop it. So for folks that did put their training objectives into the Google Doc, now that you've had a chance to kind of revise those, if you wanted to revise them, I'll actually pop in a couple of comments too. I didn't want to do it on the first drafts because sometimes it's a little bit anxiety provoking to have the professor or the teacher or the trainer to come in and say things. But now that you've had a chance to talk it over with other folks and maybe update your learning objectives, I'll come in and I'll post a couple comments, both with maybe some thoughts on the specific wording, but also maybe some ideas for activities that you might be interested in or resources that I'm aware of that might be beneficial, and that hopefully can be helpful. It's not it's just suggestions, just some thoughts that I have as somebody that's been training on this for a while. But if you do go forward with giving this specific training, you certainly don't have to listen to any of my particular suggestions. Excuse me. But yeah, so I hope that was helpful in starting to get folks, especially those of you who maybe haven't been formally trained on this, to kind of really start to think through what those steps are. Because again, your learning objectives it's the point of the training. It is the reason why you're giving the training. You want people to be able to do something. So you really want to make sure that those learning objectives are something that you can actually see people doing and that actually align with what you want them to be able to do. So hopefully that's helpful. I'll happy to open up to any questions, but for next week, there's nothing that you have to do. If you wanted to revise your learning objectives, you're more than welcome to do that in the Google Doc over the next week or so. I'll try to have comments on everybody's stuff by Monday. So you have a little bit of time to see it before the training. I blanked on what I was going to say. I guess I leave the floor open for any questions that folks might have. Otherwise, I'm really looking forward to talking about measurement next week.
Hey, Krista.
Yes.
So can we have different, ways of approach for different audiences? For example, I may include different audience like researchers, library science, and also may have a leader. So can we split leaders from researcher to provide open science and approach, specifically for fulfilling infrastructure or something, and also to design policy guideline. We may include leaders, directors, leaders, and also school deans. So can we provide the open science training, for example, the initial training at once or separately for this group? Because they need to know first what's open science mean, and just for advocating and for designing guideline policy in our context. So how can we approach that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's an evergreen question. It's a question I think folks are constantly thinking about. I think if off the top of my head, maybe how I would approach it if I was like, okay, I'm going to be hitting these different groups. These different groups have different things that they prioritize. They have different things that they're expected to do within the research process. Or maybe they're not even directly involved in the research process, but they have an impact on that research process. I might consider maybe having one kind of mixed training that covers those basics so that everybody that's in that room has a shared understanding of what open research looks like or open science looks like, and has that built understanding. But then you might do a follow-up training that's just the deans, right? And then that can focus perhaps on policies that are coming down the pipeline or ways that they can support researchers who want to do open research. And that's going to look different than, right, as you're intuiting there, like that's going to look different than a training with the researchers themselves, who are going to probably have more practical questions like, how am I supposed to share my data? Or what's a preprint, right? They may have, more specific questions about specific practices that maybe the dean doesn't necessarily super care about the ins and outs of data cleaning. But they do want to know perhaps how they can best support researchers who want to share their data. So I think that might be the approach that I would take if I were kind of planning something from the start. I might have just that introductory, what even is open science? How are people involved in open science? What are the benefits of doing so? That could be something that everybody could sit in on. And then maybe you have those specific either breakout sessions during the training or a separate training entirely that's focused to the specific questions that you think that they might have. I don't know if folks have other ideas. Certainly that's not the only way that you could do it. Lamis.
Yeah, one of the useful things that I found is that one of the very first slides I usually mention what's in it for that audience. Like, for example, especially when talking about open science, like why should they care about open science? And I think this could be easily adapted to each audience level. For example, if you're talking to the researchers and the scholars, it would be like it will increase their discoverability, their citation, their collaboration. But for example, if you're talking to administration, the dean, the vice chancellor, they're interested about the ranking, for example, of the institution, more wider and like more visible outcomes. So I usually find this really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. That value proposition for them, right? Why does this matter to me? I think can also help you to decide what groups as well. So if you have kind of a mixed audience, but you're not sure, okay, do I need to split these folks up? If you kind of think through like, why should each of them care? That might give you, there may be some groups that you kind of go, oh, actually the researchers and the librarians maybe can actually do their training together because they might have similar goals. Whereas like the administrators or community members or some other group, those might be more split off because their reasoning for caring is different. That's a really good thought. Any other thoughts or questions or comments? Otherwise, I know we're at time, so if I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if you have to drop off, feel free. If you have questions still, I have a few minutes. I'm happy to stick around. Also, just want to say you guys have had great
Thank you for the clarification. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks everyone. You guys have had great questions. I'm in the Aaron Slack, so if you have questions between now and Wednesday, feel free to message them in the trainees if that's okay, Lamis, or you can message me directly. I'm always happy to answer any questions if folks are mulling things around.
Yeah, both ways are completely okay. So I guess we cannot thank you enough. As Samira said, this was an amazing session. We cannot thank you enough, Crystal, and we cannot wait to see you next week for the final session. Thank you, Crystal, and thank you everyone for joining. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye.